When we discuss the sea wolf, one of the most argued about topics are Wolf Larsen's headaches. He's had headaches for some time, and when he's had these headaches, sometimes he would be debilitated for days at a time. Humphrey didn't try to escape earlier because he had no idea where he was going, and the crew wasn't all drunk and asleep for him to be able to try to steal away in the middle of the night. But now that everyone is kind of incapacitated for this little while, and he has the sailing know-how to try to get away, Humphrey is taking advantage of it. But we know that Wolf Larsen has had headaches, and it appears that it has had something to do with his headaches that has basically crippled him and debilitated him up to this point. We will be meeting Wolf Larsen again, spoiler alert. But at this point, what we were going to find out is the headaches are later going to make him partly paralyzed and also blind. So the assumption of the physical cause of Wolf Larsen's headaches is that he has some kind of tumor in his brain. That is the assumption. And one of the things that becomes part of the literary analysis is people ask, right, and it's kind of a chicken or an egg thing, which is, does Wolf's tumor, right, cause him to be half crazy? Or is the tumor a divine punishment or the natural consequence of a twisted mind? Because frequently, right, throughout this text, there's this debate between materialism, right? Is there really a soul, or is everything just the result of a material flesh and blood reality? And the book does not make any concrete statement one way or the other, but it is worth noting that Jack London himself is a materialist. And since he is a materialist, one of the things that he might be suggesting about Wolf Larsen is that the way he is seemingly has, his physiology, right? Because the thing is I don't think Jack London would ever say that he has had a tumor because God is punishing him or that he's being cursed with this tumor. But it may seem to say, because if we remember about Maud, remember how it suggests that her soul, her spirit, is what makes her physicality look the way it was, right? Because she's such a light and airy person, her physical form is also light and airy as well. In the same way, what London seems to be suggesting, not in a divine way, not in a spiritual way, is that the twistedness of what we might call Wolf Larsen's soul, his psyche, his mind, is what also leads to the deformity in his brain. But in the idea, basically, for London, right, the idea at the time was that for many, that all evil could be explained by some kind of physical, natural means, right? And this is a somewhat reductionist idea. That would be like saying that all criminals have brains that are somehow, or that all people who do evil acts have brains that are somehow different from the rest of us. That's a bit of a reductionist idea. But the idea is that you don't need to explain things like good and evil with things that have to be questions of the soul, right? And one of the things that Wolf Larsen had argued earlier in the book is that the soul is not the same as consciousness, right? And what he's suggesting when they're arguing about temptation is that there is no difference between what a person calls the soul and what their desire. So for Wolf Larsen, right, he would say desire and the soul are the same thing, right? Like it's not that a soul experiences desires, it's that, a desire is merely the will of the soul, right? And that they're actually the same thing. And the reason why this becomes important in terms of the literary analysis is, right, you would then say the body and the mind are also the same thing. And if the body and the mind are also the same thing, the twisted deformity of the physical brain can explain the moral deformity of Wolf Larsen's character, right? That would be the way that the materialist might try to explain this analysis. But if you were to try to look at this book in beyond good and evil, if you want to think that good and evil are more than just physical material realities, right? There is this kind of strange idea of how they have this discussion about being Lucifer and being unrepentant and taking what you want. And this is the night, right? This is the night where Wolf Larsen tries to commit sexual assault, right? It's kind of unknown why Wolf Larsen waits until this night. It's possible that he wanted to do it on a night where there would be mostly no witnesses. All the crew was asleep. But from what we've read in the book, we think he's done this before, and it's kind of unknown why he waits till now. Maybe we know because he was not. Remember how it said he was earlier? It talked about how he was voluble, right? That meant he couldn't keep his mouth shut. It's very possible that he's lacking his self-control, right? The analysis that we need to understand. So if he's unable to shut up, right, and the fact that they're talking about temptation, right, the general idea is the reason why they're having this discussion in the first place is because Wolf Larsen himself is undergoing temptation at that moment, that he has been suppressing his desire to do what he wants for some time, right? And that he seemingly is having difficulty in repressing himself any longer, right? That seems to be the idea, right? Because the very night they're talking about temptation and desire and whether or not one can control themselves, right? This is the night where he apparently seems to lose control and he tries to do this terrible thing. And in so doing is seemingly struck by this illness along the same line, right? So one of the things that is being talked about and the question that is being asked is the discussion of temptation a prelude to the fact that Wolf is maybe wanting to change or keep himself from losing control? Is it possible, because as we remember in the typical romance narrative, right, the lovely woman somehow gets the tiger to change his stripes, right? That's generally how it goes. And in that sense, what London seems to be hinting at is he's kind of mimicking the way a romance story often goes, where, the brute is going to be tamed and he'll be good after all, and he'll be domesticated after all. But at the end, he can't. In the end, even though he seems to have tried to practice a certain degree of self-control up to a point, he finally breaks. His beastly nature is not able to be contained. And the idea of this in terms of the discussion of the greater book is just the idea that creatures are more nature than nurture, right? That seems to be London's idea, because you remember London was into eugenics, right? And that Wolf is not able to not be a wolf in the end, that he is always a predator, and that even though he tries to change his behavior, right, that he is predisposed, right? The idea of the tumor, the idea of being predisposed to being a villain. And the idea of being predisposed to being a villain, at times, like the way people were studying psychology at the time of the Sea Wolf, was they were trying to figure out what natural clues were there to figure out who is going to be good and who is going to be bad, and then figuring out ahead of time so that we can get rid of the bad people, right? But in terms of temptation and what we need to talk about with the final danger, right? The final danger and this escape that is being made, and also when the other idea of him being a male Circe, right? You have to understand that Circe in the Odyssey, right, when she kept Odysseus a prisoner on her island for a time and not letting him go home, the point is, and this is a foreshadowing, right? The foreshadowing of calling him a male Circe is Circe kept her prisoner as a sex slave, right? Like that's, there's no nice way of saying it. Like the situation between Odysseus and Circe in the Odyssey is the situation of him being an unwilling sex slave. And so this seems to be a foreshadowing of the fact that Wolf Larsen is slowly moving toward sexual assault. And this has been hinted at for chapter upon chapter, right? When he says, maybe I should make, you deserve to be the wife of a pirate king, right? He says that to her in the previous chapter, right? And so, in this kind of old, brutal, savage kind of way, right? This is maybe him trying to like take her as his bride in some kind of sick and perverse kind of action of that scene because he feels triumphant and now it is time for another conquest, right? This is this other, idea that is being put forth about the relationships and the idea that it's anti-romance because in the typical sea romance narrative, when love is a conquest, right. Notice to refer to something as a conquest, it does imply the use of force, right, and that's kind of a fairly ugly idea. But usually, what happens is that in those narratives, right, the pirate or the bad captain, he will kiss her and she'll resist and she'll resist and she'll resist, but then she'll give in, right? And in this, right, we see that with Hump interrupting, right, we don't know if Maud would have eventually surrendered. I think it's highly indicated that she wouldn't, right? But sometimes that kind of surrender in that situation, in those narratives, has to do with something referred to as Stockholm syndrome. That means when a captee begins to associate with their captor, they begin to become friendly and they ally with their captor in order to stay alive, right? Sometimes the idea is submission and surrender is preferable to just being killed, right? That's the idea. So so London is trying to turn this trope on its head, where Maud resists, and instead of Maud all of a sudden being conquered, all of a sudden being unable to resist, it is Wolf Larsen who is ultimately made weak and struck down in the moment. And he's turning that on its head. And even though, right, he is in the middle of doing this terrible thing, even though it would seem natural to want to let Humphrey stab him to death right then and there, Maud retains her dignity, right? But the idea of the retaining of the dignity, it's once again, it's the contrast between the civilized and the savage, right? And in this case, right, we've seen that Humphrey, right, has actually gone savage, right? He is actually partly savage in this moment. He attacks Wolf Larsen with that knife. He would have murdered him. But once again, right, it is actually Maud who keeps him from going all the way and becoming a murderer and becoming and killing him with a knife, right? And once again, right, when we talked about how romances tend to seem to suggest that, the beautiful woman changes the bad man, right? In this case, the beautiful woman was not able to change the bad man. But what the beautiful woman was able to do in the kind of the inverse was to keep the honorable man from becoming dishonorable himself, right? That's the change. That's the difference that London is going for in this. That Maud's beauty and the force of civilization, it can't bring Wolf Larsen, make him something he's not, because whatever makes him what he is, whether it's a tumor in the brain or his nature is just being a primitive man, that's fixed. A tiger can't really change his stripes, not in the mind of someone of eugenics. But according to Jack London, what is Humphrey? Ultimately, Humphrey is, no matter how strong he's had to get, Humphrey ultimately is a gentleman, right? And even though he's had to learn to become a competent sailor, get much physically stronger, learn how to use a knife, learn how to sail, learn how to survive, be able to walk on his own legs, so to speak. Even though he's now stronger and he's had to learn how to survive among savages, Humphrey Van Weyden is still, at the end, a gentleman. And that is what comes out in this scene. And that is what, again, turns the typical idea of the sea romance on its head. And so now, for the next few chapters, what we are going to see, now that Hump and Maud have escaped on the boat, now they have to survive on the ocean in a little boat. And now certain elements of their one-on-one romance of the story can begin. These are some of the weaker chapters of the book, but we won't have to deal with those until next week. Remember that the quiz for this is going to be dropping on Google Classroom on Thursday. But until then, I just want you to remember that Jesus loves you, and so do I. And I hope you're still enjoying the Seawolf. So I'll see you guys very soon, and I hope we can see each other in person sooner than we all expect.